He stood in the lobby, bags in his trembling hands, when the landlord's voice cut through the room like a blade. An elderly black couple, shamed in front of strangers, called undesirable, told they'd be thrown out of the home they had loved for decades. No warnings, no violations, just raw, intentional cruelty. But what the landlord didn't know was that the people he tried to humiliate had someone in their corner, someone powerful, someone he never expected. And when the truth came for him, everything changed. Comment and tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Samuel Brooks had lived a quiet, disciplined life, one shaped by decades of hard work, responsibility, and quiet dignity. For more than 30 years, he had sorted mail in the Atlanta heat and winter cold, never missing a shift, never asking for favors, never giving anyone a reason to doubt his integrity. Now in his 70s, his days had grown slower, gentler. Each morning began the same way, sunlight warming the living room window, the soft hum of the city below, and the peaceful rhythm of Evelyn humming her favorite hymns as she tended to her plants. Their apartment wasn't just a place to live, it was the story of their entire life together. Every picture on the wall, every scratch on the floor, every framed memory told a chapter of the love they had built. It was the home where they found each other, healed old wounds, and raised a boy who arrived with fear in his eyes and left as a man who carried the weight of justice on his shoulders. Judge Malcolm Price, the son they had chosen, loved, and guided, had grown into one of the most respected federal judges in the state. But Samuel and Evelyn never lived with pride or arrogance. Their days were simple. Morning coffee, church programs on the fridge, visits from neighbors who adored them, and quiet evenings on the balcony watching Atlanta fade into dusk. They believed kindness mattered, honesty mattered, and dignity mattered, even in a world that often denied those things to people who looked like them. Still, Samuel sensed something shifting in the building. The renovated lobby, the new faces, the subtle whispers about changes coming. He ignored it at first. After all, they had lived here for decades without trouble. They had paid every bill, followed every rule, respected every neighbor. But sometimes trouble comes quietly, long before anyone realizes it has already begun. And Samuel was about to discover that the peace he cherished was more fragile than he ever imagined. The first sign arrived quietly, so quietly that Samuel almost dismissed it. A sudden knock one morning, hours earlier than anyone usually visited. When he opened the door, the building's owner, Richard Hale, stood there with a stiffness in his posture that felt rehearsed, almost strategic. He carried a clipboard and an expression that radiated authority without empathy. Without pause, he walked into the apartment, scanning each corner with the calculating eyes of a man searching for something he already believed he would find. Samuel watched as Richard inspected cabinets, corners, walls, anywhere a flaw could be twisted into a weapon. The apartment had aged, yes, but every mark told the story of a family that had lived with care and love. Yet Richard seemed eager to assign blame, eager to redefine their home as a problem. When he examined a small water stain on the ceiling, one that had lingered for years despite maintenance requests, his expression darkened, not with concern but with satisfaction. Samuel felt it instantly. This wasn't an inspection, it was preparation. After Richard left, silence filled the home like a storm cloud settling over the walls. Evelyn stood by the kitchen counter, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't need words to understand what Samuel already feared. Something was beginning, and it wasn't accidental. Days later, the fear became real. A crisp white envelope arrived in the mail, its weight heavier than paper should allow. Inside was an official notice accusing them of violations they had never committed. Claims of damage, accusations of rule-breaking, fabricated infractions written with confidence, as if the truth no longer mattered. The letter ended with a message that shattered the peace they had cherished. They had 30 days to leave. The news hit Evelyn like a blow, her breath catching as she stared at words meant to erase decades of stability. Samuel felt something inside him fracture, not from fear of losing the apartment, but from the realization that their honesty, dignity, and decades of loyalty meant nothing to those who saw them only as obstacles to profit. From that moment forward, the harassment intensified. Maintenance requests were ignored. Utilities flickered unpredictably. Notices appeared on their door claiming noise complaints that the neighbors insisted they never filed. Strangers entered for final inspections, touching their belongings, photographing private spaces, treating their home as though it belonged to a criminal investigation. Each intrusion chipped away at the sense of safety they had built over a lifetime. Richard seemed to relish the quiet power he held, the power to unsettle, to intimidate, to remind them that in his eyes they were invisible. And each time Samuel crossed paths with him in the lobby or hallways, Richard carried the same smug confidence, the kind that comes from believing consequences never apply to people like him. Evelyn began withdrawing, sitting longer by the window, her hands clasped as if holding tightly to the pieces of a life slipping away. Samuel stayed strong for her, but inside he felt the weight of every injustice pushing down on him. He had lived through enough to recognize when a battle wasn't fair, and when it was being waged deliberately. But what Richard had failed to understand was this: a lifetime of dignity doesn't crumble easily. And Samuel Brooks, despite the years etched into his hands and face, carried a strength born from surviving a world long tilted against him. As day 28 approached, just 2 days before they were supposed to leave, the pressure reached its peak. Tension filled the apartment like a storm ready to break. Evelyn's spirit seemed drained, and Samuel knew something had to change. And far away, their son, Judge Malcolm Price, was about to receive a phone call that would ignite a reckoning no one in that building was prepared for. Day 29 arrived with a heaviness that settled over the building long before the sun climbed over the Atlanta skyline. The air felt different, thicker, charged, as if the walls themselves sensed what was coming. Samuel and Evelyn tried to go about their morning like they had done for decades, but nothing about this day felt familiar. Every movement carried the weight of uncertainty, every breath the ache of being pushed toward an ending they did not deserve. Samuel had barely finished sorting the morning mail when the building's lobby erupted with a sudden wave of voices. Heavy footsteps, hurried whispers, the distinct shuffle of people expecting something significant to unfold. He and Evelyn moved slowly toward the hallway, unsure of what they would find, unaware that everything in their lives was seconds away from shifting. Outside, a sleek black sedan rolled to a stop, quiet, deliberate, unmistakably official. The door opened, and out stepped their son. Judge Malcolm Price carried himself with the steady composure of a man who had seen the justice system from every angle, but this moment carved something new into his expression, something fierce, unyielding, deeply personal. He wasn't here as a judge today. He was here as a son defending the only people who ever believed in him. Inside the building, Richard Hale emerged from his office with his usual confidence, expecting another quiet day of control, another chance to display his power without consequence. But as he stepped into the lobby and laid eyes on Malcolm, the mask he wore every day cracked. Authority shifted instantly. The balance he had dictated for weeks evaporated. What followed was a silent collision of two worlds, one built on decades of prejudice, entitlement, and unchecked cruelty, and the other built on resilience, dignity, and a lifetime of overcoming the odds. The evidence Malcolm carried was not a stack of papers. It was a narrative of every injustice Richard had inflicted, every manipulation he believed no one would ever challenge. Witnesses emerged from every corner of the building. Some watched with guilt for staying silent, others with hope that maybe this was the moment change finally arrived for all of them. The entire lobby transformed into a stage where truth stripped power from the man who believed he controlled everything. Richard's confidence faltered as reality closed in from every direction. The arrival of federal authorities, the weight of documented discrimination, the presence of a judge whose life story stood as proof that those he labeled powerless were anything but. And as the walls of the lobby absorbed the tension, the world seemed to pause. For the first time in weeks, Samuel and Evelyn stood with their heads high, no longer carrying the burden of fear. The man who had tried to break them now faced the consequences of every choice he'd made. Everything Richard believed about them, about race, about status, about who deserved to stay and who could be erased, was about to come crashing down. And the moment those handcuffs closed, nothing in that building would ever be the same again. When the handcuffs clicked around Richard Hale's wrists, the weight that had pressed on Samuel and Evelyn for weeks seemed to lift in an instant. The lobby that had once been a place of humiliation now echoed with relief, gratitude, and quiet triumph. Neighbors stepped forward, people who had once watched from the sidelines, offering support, comfort, and apologies. It didn't erase the pain, but it proved something powerful. Injustice had not won. In the weeks that followed, the building transformed under new management. Repairs that had been ignored for years were finally addressed. Voices that had been silenced were now heard. For the first time in a long time, the residents felt like they belonged. Samuel and Evelyn remained in their home, their dignity intact, their names cleared. Their life returned to the gentle rhythm they had always cherished. Morning light through the window, the sound of Evelyn's hymns, the familiar comfort of the space they built together. Yet something deeper had shifted. Their story spread across the community, a reminder that racism doesn't always shout. It often hides behind paperwork, policies, and people who believe power excuses cruelty. What happened inside that apartment building was not an isolated act. It reflected a much larger truth. Housing discrimination against black families remains one of the most devastating, yet underreported, injustices in America today. Judge Malcolm Price never sought recognition. What mattered to him was simple. The people who had rescued him, raised him, and taught him what justice truly meant were finally safe. Their strength became a testament that even in moments of fear, even in the face of cruelty, standing firm can change everything. And as Samuel and Evelyn sat together on their balcony, watching the sunset wash over the city, they knew their fight had never been just for themselves. It was for every family who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unprotected. Because this story wasn't just about an eviction, it was about dignity. It was about refusing to disappear. It was about reminding the world that justice is built one courageous stand at a time. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And make sure you subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen.